A little girl crouched beside a coal sack, her hand trembling as she scrawled a line of poetry in white chalk. Dust covers my dress like words no one got to say. No one knew that those words born of pain and charcoal would one day make a nation weep. That night in the rain, she buried her dying three-legged dog beneath the old coal field and carved into a piece of wood. Some dogs never bark. They just lie beside sorrow and love it their whole life. You won't look away from Akosua's journey from a crumbling wooden shack to the literary stage of Ga, from rejected poems to a book that healed hearts across generations. Subscribe now to catch every powerful, raw, and deeply human story we bring to life. Welcome to where light is written out of darkness. Under the scorching Ghanaian sun, the blackened landscape of the charcoal field lay still smoldering quietly as if it held its breath. Jagged sacks of coal formed uneven mounds across the open yard, casting long shadows that melted into the dirt. The air was thick, laced with soot and memory. At the center of this quiet battlefield between fire and survival knelt a small girl, her knees dusty, her back hunched like she was protecting something fragile from the world. Akosua, 11 years old, held a stub of white chalk like it was a quill made of gold. She wasn't drawing or doodling. She was writing word by word on the crumpled burlap sack in front of her. The sack was stitched with wire filled with broken coal chunks, some still warm from the morning haul. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from an intensity that did not belong to a child. Her eyes, wide and heavy-lashed, scanned each word as she wrote the chalk, whispering across the rough texture. The dust clings to my dress like words no one got to say. A gust of wind passed, lifting the hem of her faded green smock. She paused, shielding the half-written lines. The coal sack would be gone in minutes, loaded onto a cart sold to someone who'd burn it, without ever seeing what was scrawled on its side. But that didn't matter to her. The act of writing was enough. The words existed, even if no one would read them. Behind her, the wooden shack creaked softly in the wind. It leaned like it was tired of standing, the tin roof patched with plastic and old election posters. Smoke curled from a chimney pipe made from an old bicycle frame. The shack wasn't a home, it was a survival tactic. It housed three things: Akosua, her grandmother Ama, and a three-legged golden mutt named Obo. Obo watched her now from a patch of shade beneath a broken wheelbarrow. His ears twitched, not from noise, but instinct. Every so often he tilted his head as if trying to understand the strange ritual the girl repeated every day. He had known her since the day she learned to walk across this charcoal field barefoot, never complaining about the heat or the ash that clung to her ankles. She was different, and the dog knew it. Inside the shack, Ama coughed a dry, persistent sound like broom bristles scratching tin. Akosua didn't flinch. The cough was part of the morning soundtrack, as predictable as the rooster that never crowed and the wind that never brought rain. The sun was rising fast, turning the ash-laced soil silver. Akosua knelt straighter, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with a chalk-stained hand. Then she stood, wiped her fingers on her skirt, and stepped back to read what she had written. Her lips moved silently, mouthing each word. She knew the chalk wouldn't last much longer, neither would the sack. But it didn't matter. Each morning she wrote on a new one. Sometimes two. If the day was quiet and no one shouted at her to fetch water or stack wood, maybe three. Then when the sun reached the zinc roof and made it too hot to stand barefoot on the ground, she'd collect the empties, brush the ashes from them, and tuck them into a plastic bag under her bed. She called it her book. Akosua had never gone to school. Not officially. The only classroom she had known was the back corner of the shack, where a battered radio whispered into the night. Each evening, when Ama finally laid down her bones on the raffia mat and closed her eyes, Akosua would crouch by the radio, one hand on the volume dial, the other tracing letters in the dirt. The BBC's African service, the nightly news in Fante, the poems read at midnight on Joy FM. These were her textbooks. The neighbors thought she was strange, whispering to herself by moonlight. One woman even said she was possessed by shadows. Akosua smiled when she heard that. Shadows were loyal. They didn't leave. There had been a girl once, Akosua, who had gone to school with a clean dress and a backpack that zipped. She lived 2 doors down and had a laugh like the clink of glass beads. One day, Akosua caught Akosua scribbling in the dirt with a charcoal twig. "What are you writing?" she asked. Akosua had shrugged. "A poem." Akosua frowned. "But we're not supposed to waste coal." "It's not for the fire," Akosua said. "It's for remembering." That was the only conversation they ever had. Akosua moved away a week later. But the memory stayed wrapped like ribbon around Akosua's resolve. If she couldn't afford paper, she'd use sacks. If she couldn't buy pens, she'd use chalk. If her words couldn't be kept, she'd write them into the day, like prayer smoke on morning wind. Now back in the charcoal yard, the sun pushed higher. Obo whined softly, his one good front leg twitching as he stretched. Akosua turned to him. "Time to eat," she asked. The dog's ears perked. He rose and limped toward her, brushing against her knee with practiced affection. She reached into her smock pocket, pulled out a crumbled slice of plantain, and offered half. He ate slowly, as if grateful not just for the food, but for the moment. From inside the shack, Amma's voice called out a low, tired croak. "Akoa, bring the basin. We need to rinse today's load." Akosua didn't answer. She walked slowly to the wall of coal sacks and laid her hand on the one she had just written on. Her fingers hovered over the words. For a moment she considered erasing them. But then she stepped away. Let the world read it or not. Let the coal merchant see it or not. The words were there. They had been born. She picked up the metal basin, balanced it on her hip, and called softly to Obo, who followed her like a shadow with breath. As she passed the sack, her fingers brushed the chalk once more, and on screen in soft white text over black coal, the lines shimmered into view. "The dust clings to my dress like words no one got to say." The camera held on it just long enough for silence to land. Then the screen faded to black. The sound of the basin sloshing water took over as the story moved forward. But something stayed behind with that line. A poem, written in chalk, on a bag of coal. The mid-morning heat clung to her skin like a second layer of clothing. Dust curled in lazy swirls behind her sandals as she made her way along the jagged path that separated the village school from the charcoal yard. Abena had been in this lakeside town for 3 weeks now, just long enough to memorize the cries of the fishermen at dawn, and the way the wind stiffened before the afternoon rain, but still not long enough to feel like she belonged. She adjusted the strap of her shoulder bag. Its weight filled not with books, but with papers in need of grading questions left unanswered and quiet conversations overheard through classroom windows. As a volunteer teacher from Accra, she had thought she would be the one doing the teaching. But each day here chipped away at that illusion. These children were teaching her something deeper: how to survive with dignity, how to wait for the world without bitterness. She walked slower today, no particular reason. Maybe it was the light softer, as though the clouds were hesitating, or the sound of a goat bleating somewhere behind her, oddly like a laugh. She passed the blackened piles of coal sacks, most of them already picked up for the morning haul. The ground crackled beneath her feet, scorched earth brittle from years of flame. That's when she saw it. A plastic rice sack tucked behind a stack of torn charcoal bags, wedged next to a rusting tin barrel. It might have gone unnoticed, if not for the strange white smears along its sides, like someone had dragged chalk across it in bursts of anger or longing. She paused. Something about it refused to let her eyes go. It wasn't the way it was hidden, half buried, nearly discarded, but the air around it heavy with something unspoken. She crouched, brushing away a layer of ash. Her fingers found the knot and undid it carefully. The sack peeled open with a dry whisper. Inside were 6 other coal bags, flattened and folded, their rough fabric streaked with chalky lines. Abena hesitated. This wasn't hers. This was someone's discarded something. But her hand moved on its own, lifting the first bag. Then she saw it. Fire doesn't burn as deep as the eyes of someone walking away. She froze. The words leapt off of the sack, not because they were beautiful, though they were, but because they were raw, unfiltered. It wasn't poetry written for applause. It was the kind that bled out of someone who didn't know where else to put the hurt. She read it again and again. Her breath caught. Who had written this? She opened the next one. My house has 3 walls and no roof. But at least no one lies to me when it rains. Her fingers trembled. There were spelling mistakes. The handwriting was uneven, some letters slipping off the edges. But the weight of each line was undeniable. They weren't clever. They were honest. They weren't polished. They were true. Abina stood slowly, holding the bundle like something sacred. She looked around. The coal yard was quiet now. A couple of boys were hauling sacks toward a truck, their arms smeared with soot. A dog barked in the distance, but no one was watching her. She moved to the shade beneath a crooked tree and sat down, spreading the sacks across the dry earth. One by one, she read them all. I sleep next to smoke, but dream of snow. The teacher on the radio says snow is white like teeth. But I've seen teeth that bite and never smile. She choked back a sudden sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. The lines didn't come from someone who had learned poetry in school. They came from a life lived in the margins. They came from a child. That much she was sure of. But how? Her thoughts swirled. She imagined the writer, a boy perhaps sitting alone with a piece of chalk and a full heart, or maybe a girl barefoot listening to the night hum while words formed like prayers. Whoever it was, they were not supposed to be invisible. Not with a voice like this. Abina packed the sacks back into the rice bag with care, as if they might fall apart under too much touch. She stood and turned toward the path that led to the village. She needed to find them. She began her search that same day. It was a Thursday sticky with humidity. The students at the school were preparing a recitation of Proverbs, and she had just told them she needed to step out for a short walk. She didn't mention what for. Something told her this wasn't meant for casual conversation. She returned to the charcoal yard this time, walking slowly between the workers, scanning every face. Most were older men and women, their hands thick from labor. But there were children, 2 little ones, running errands, girls no older than 10 tying bags, boys dragging wheelbarrows. "Excuse me," she asked one woman. "Do you know who usually leaves bags behind? Like bags with writing." The woman squinted, writing. "Chalk, on the sacks." The woman frowned. "Waste of chalk," she said, shaking her head. Another man nearby chimed in. "There's a girl sometimes. Small one, sits near the edge. Strange one, always whispering to herself." Abina's heart thudded. "Do you know her name?" He shrugged. "Akosua maybe lives in that shack near the cassava pit. The one with the dog?" The name rang like a bell in her chest. Abina followed the dirt path they pointed out, weaving past fish racks and laundry lines. She had passed this way before but never looked closely. Now she did. The shack stood like a memory half forgotten, leaning patched, held together by hope and rope. There were no shoes outside, just a crooked broom and a basin of dark water. A yellow mutt barked once and then lay down again. Abina stood there for a moment, uncertain. Then the door creaked open, and out stepped a girl. She was small, thin to the point of translucence, with soot-streaked cheeks and a braid that had unraveled into wisps. She didn't look surprised to see Abina, only wary. The two stared at each other. I think Abina said gently, "You dropped something beautiful." The girl didn't answer, but her eyes, dark, steady, storm-like, locked onto the rice sack in Abina's hands. "I read your poems." Abina added, her voice softer now. "I couldn't help it." Still silence. Abina stepped closer. She took a folded piece of sack from the bundle and held it out. This line, "Even the wind forgets to visit us some nights," that's yours, isn't it? The girl's lips parted just slightly. Then she looked down at her bare feet. "My name is Abina," the teacher said. "I came from Accra to teach here. But I think you might be the one teaching me." The dog stood and moved to the girl's side. She reached down to touch his head. Then finally, quietly, as if speaking might make the moment vanish, she said, "I didn't think anyone would read them." Abena crouched so they were eye level. "I think the world needs to read them." From behind them, a door inside the shack groaned. An older voice called out a woman's, cracked and weary. The girl turned. "I have to go," she said. "Wait," Abena said, standing. "Please, can we talk again? I'd love to hear more. Maybe you could show me where you write." The girl looked up again. "You want to see the sacks?" "I want to see the words," Abena corrected gently. "And the girl who makes them." There was a pause. Then almost shyly Akosua nodded, and as she turned to step inside the shack, the teacher remained in place, the rice sack in her arms, now heavier than ever, not with coal but with a truth so raw it could set the sky on fire. Under the mid-afternoon haze, the village lay quietly, each sound muffled, as if the world was waiting for something to break its breathless stillness. The trees beyond the charcoal field trembled softly in the light wind, their shadows stretching across cracked red soil. Every path in this part of the village ended somewhere uncertain, but Abena's steps were deliberate. She followed not a map, but a trail of words she could still hear echoing in her mind. She had spent the past 2 hours asking questions, receiving mostly shrugs and wary glances. Charcoal sellers weren't quick to entertain strangers poking into their routine, let alone asking about a girl who wasted chalk. But one woman peeling cassava at her doorstep had said, "That child Akosua. She lives in the wooden shack near the dead baobab." That was all Abena needed. Now she stood at the edge of that path, staring at the small structure that looked like it could fall apart with a single gust of wind. The shack was silent. No smoke from the chimney, no voice, no laughter, just stillness. She took a breath, walked closer. From behind a stack of charcoal sacks, a golden dog stirred. It limped into view, three-legged, skinny, with eyes too knowing for a creature so battered. It didn't bark. It just stood between her and the door like a quiet guardian. Abena stopped, crouched slightly. "Hello there," she whispered. "You must be Obo." The dog tilted its head. Then, sensing no threat, it slowly padded to her, sniffed her hand and leaned against her knee. The door creaked open. Akosua appeared barefoot, small arms folded tightly across her chest, like she was holding herself in. Her eyes darted to the dog, then to the rice sack in Abena's arms. Abena straightened. She didn't speak right away, just really looked at the girl, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There was too much weight in the space between them. Then softly Akosua said, "You shouldn't be here." Abena nodded. "Maybe not. But I read your words." Akosua's eyes flickered, something almost like panic crossing her face. "I didn't give them to you." "I know," Abena replied. "But they found me anyway." The girl's grip on her own arms tightened. "They're not good." "They're not just good," Abena said. "They're honest. They hurt. They breathe." Akosua stepped back into the doorway. "They were just something to do. When I'm bored." "Then your boredom is more powerful than most people's effort?" Abena said, her voice steady. "May I come in?" Akosua hesitated clearly, torn between suspicion and a strange kind of curiosity. "Why?" Abena reached into the sack, pulled out a folded piece of coal fabric, and began to read. "When no one listens, I write. When no one stays, I sit with the coal. The coal at least remembers the fire." As the final line hung in the air, Akosua's face changed, something behind her eyes, cracked open like a dam under pressure. Her lips parted and her body trembled. "Stop," she whispered. But Abena didn't. She unfolded another scrap and read again. "I once tried to shout at the sky. It answered with silence. Now I write quieter than breathing, and the wind carries it better." Akosua made a strangled sound, and then the tears came first, one, then an unstoppable flood. She didn't wail. She didn't run. She just stood there, shaking her face, twisted with disbelief that someone, anyone, had not only read her pain, but spoken it out loud. Abena stepped forward slowly, careful not to spook the moment. "It's okay," she said gently. "You don't have to explain. I just wanted you to know. Your words matter. They reached me. Akosua tried to speak, but all that came out was a sob. She covered her face with her hands, leaning slightly against the doorframe like she needed it to stay standing. From inside the shack, an older voice rasped, "Akosua." "Who's crying out there?" Abena looked past the girl. A wrinkled woman with silver hair tied in a knot sat on a mat just inside her back, bent like a question mark. Her eyes were dim but sharp. Akosua wiped her face and turned. "Just a teacher," she mumbled. Abena stepped in slowly, reverently. The air inside was thick with the scent of ash oil and something earthy old wood, maybe. A pot of corn porridge simmered on a small charcoal stove. The room was barely wider than a storage closet with 3 makeshift mats along the walls and a window with no glass, only cloth pinned in place. Obo followed them in and immediately settled beside the older woman. Abena bowed slightly. "Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Abena. I teach at the school by the lake." The old woman raised an eyebrow. "You've come here for school fees? We don't owe any," No, Abena said, smiling gently. "I came here because your granddaughter is a poet." The woman let out a dry laugh. "Poet in this shack? I'm serious," Abena said, sitting slowly on the edge of the mat. "She writes like she's seen through the world." The grandmother turned her gaze to Akosua, who stood awkwardly near the corner, wiping her nose with the hem of her dress. "Is this true, Akosua?" Akosua shrugged. "I just write. That's what poets say," Abena added. There was silence for a moment. Then the grandmother reached for the pot and stirred the porridge. "Well, if the sky has finally sent someone with ears, let them eat first before talking about clouds," she muttered. "Sit. Eat." Abena smiled. They gathered around the bowl, each with a calabash. The porridge was thin, barely more than corn water, but it carried warmth. As they ate, Obo crept over to Abena and curled up beside her. She reached out and touched his back gently. He gave a soft grunt of approval and placed his head on her knee. The silence became companionable, comfortable. Then Abena turned to Akosua. "Would you show me where you write?" The girl looked unsure. "It's not a real place." "Then it's the perfect place," Abena replied. Akosua stood hesitant, then motioned for her to follow. They stepped outside past the shack to a broken slab of concrete that used to be the foundation of a larger home, long gone, eaten by time. Under a small tin sheet leaned against a rock was a plastic box with faded stickers. Akosua knelt and opened it. Inside were scraps of sacks, bits of torn paper, even the inside of cigarette boxes, each one covered in handwriting. Abena crouched beside her and stared, stunned. There must have been over 50 pieces. Some were poems. Some were fragments. Some were single lines, brutal in their simplicity. "I miss people I never met. I think God ran out of pages before he reached me. Sometimes I wish I was coal. At least people pick it up." Abena didn't say anything for a long time. Then softly, "Has anyone ever read these?" Akosua shook her head. "I didn't think anyone would want to." "I do," Abena said, her voice breaking. The girl looked at her, really looked, searching for the lie. But there was none. Only awe. And maybe underneath it all, recognition. "You don't think it's embarrassing?" Akosua asked. Abena smiled, her eyes damp. "I think the world would be lucky to be embarrassed by such beauty." A breeze passed between them, lifting the corners of the pages in the box. Obo barked softly from the doorway, as if to say, "Don't forget me." They both looked back at him, then laughed quietly together. In that moment between the dog's sigh, the wind's hush, and the charcoal dust drifting like memory, something unspoken was sealed. A bond not forged by blood, but by words, and maybe, just maybe, by hope. Under the pale glow of an oil lamp, the shack was quieter than usual. Outside, a night wind rattled the zinc roof, and somewhere beyond the charcoal stacks, a goat bleated, once then fell silent. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of warm ash and boiled cassava. Amma had gone to sleep early, curled on the straw mat with a cough muffled into the corner of her wrapper. Obo lay at her feet, his breathing steady, one ear, twitching in rhythm with the storm of dreams behind his eyelids. Akosua sat near the door, her knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. Her eyes followed the flicker of the flame that danced along the shack's wooden walls. The words were coming again. She could feel them unfolding in her like vines, slow but insistent. Abina sat across from her legs, crossed, scribbling notes in a worn notebook. She had stayed long after dinner, after Amma had said, "You might as well sleep here if you're staying this long." But neither woman moved to leave, as if both of them knew tonight was meant for something important. "Do you keep all your poems?" Abena asked softly, not wanting to wake Amma. Akosua looked up startled. "Most of them. The ones I don't forget." "Where do you keep them?" A pause. Then the girl pointed under the raised wooden platform that served as a bed. "There's a box. It used to hold soap. But it's wood." Abina moved slowly, lifting the corner of a thin sheet. Her fingers brushed dust, then wood. She pulled the box into the center of the room. It was no bigger than a school bag. The latch was rusted, but intact. Faint letters read, "Sunlight. Family pack in peeling blue paint." One corner had a faded sticker of a Ghanaian flag. Akosua reached over and undid the latch with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. The lid creaked open, releasing the scent of old paper and charcoal like forgotten time. Inside a miracle, not in gold or jewels, but in scraps. Dozens of folded pieces, some the size of a matchbox, others torn from larger fabric. Bits of charcoal sack, inner linings of biscuit wrappers, the back of a sardine label. Even the inner shell of a broken flip-flop bore words. Everything that could hold ink or chalk or charcoal had become a canvas. Abina lifted the top layer with reverent fingers. Each piece held a world. She unfolded one, an old envelope smeared with dust. The handwriting was jagged, desperate, but powerful. "I want to love someone the way darkness loves a flame, not to kill it, but to know it by heat alone." Abina felt something shift in her chest. She reached for another, and another. "I do not fear silence. It has been my only audience. When my stomach groans, I write it a lullaby." She stopped, looked up at Akosua. These aren't just poems. They're survival." Akosua shrugged, her voice barely audible. "They're just how I don't go mad." Abena placed the pieces carefully back into the box. Her eyes shimmered, but her voice stayed steady. "You write like smoke. Your lines rise and vanish, but they stay in the lungs." Akosua blinked. "Is that good?" "That's unforgettable." Silence settled for a moment. Abena traced her fingers along the rim of the box. "Have you ever thought," she asked, "about letting others read these?" Akosua stared at her. "What?" "Because they deserve it," Abena said. "And you do too." The girl laughed, but it wasn't joyful. It was a quiet, bitter sound. Who would care about poems written on trash? "Poems don't care where they're written," Abena said. "They only care where they land." Akosua frowned. "Even if people laugh, they won't. They will." "Then let them," Abena replied. "Let them laugh. But let them read." She paused, leaning forward. "I know someone. In Accra. He runs a small press. He prints things no one else will touch, voices that aren't polished or famous. If he reads even one of these, he'll know." And Akosua stared at her, eyes wide. "You want to take them?" "No," Abena said. "I want to show them. With your permission. Not one word leaves this room without it." Akosua didn't answer right away. Her fingers grazed the edge of the box, tracing a knot in the wood. Then almost too softly to hear, "Do you think they'll call me fake?" "No." "Poor." Abena smiled. "You are poor. But that's not a crime, and your poverty doesn't define your poetry. Your honesty does." Akosua looked down. Something shifted in her expression, just a flicker. But when she looked up again, the air felt different. "Okay," she said. "Just don't lose them." "I won't. And don't let them change my words." "Never." Akosua nodded slowly. Then for the first time since Abena had met her, she smiled, not wide, not bright, but real. A crack of dawn in a night full of dust. From behind them, the shuffle of fabric and the rasp of breath. Amma was sitting up. Her eyes glinted in the dim light. "What are you two plotting with that box?" Abena turned. "We're thinking of sharing Akosua's poems with a publisher." Amma's expression hardened. "A publisher?" "Yes," Abena said gently. "In Accra. He works with young writers. Amos snorted. In Accra, they drink tea and lie with clean mouths. They don't care for girls who sleep on ashes. He's not like that, Abena said. He's printed stories from boys in the street, from women in shelters. He listens. Ama narrowed her eyes. And then what? They give her a book, a crown. And when they're bored of her words, they leave, like her father. The room fell silent. Akosua's breath caught. Abena swallowed. This isn't a trap, ma'am. I don't promise crowns. I only promise the chance to be heard. Ama looked at her granddaughter. She doesn't know what it means to dream and lose, she said. But I do. Dreaming is easy. Waking up with nothing is the part no one tells you. Akosua's voice came then, quiet but clear. Then let me try. Just once. Ama's jaw tightened. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then she slumped back onto her mat. Do what you must, she said. But if this breaks her, I will hold you in my prayers, and they are not kind. I understand, Abena said softly. She turned to Akosua. We'll start small. One envelope, one story, just a taste. Akosua nodded, reaching into the box and selecting a folded piece of wrapper. She handed it over without a word. Abena tucked it carefully into her bag. Tomorrow, she said, standing. I'll take this to Accra. I'll call you from the school if he replies. Akosua didn't move. Her fingers rested on the edge of the wooden box. But in her eyes, the coal sparkled. For the first time, something more than survival flickered inside her. It was hope, quiet, trembling, but alive. And in a room where everything was broken or borrowed, that made it the rarest thing of all. The road to Accra was dust-covered and blistered by the sun. From the back of the trotro, Abena held the plastic folder against her chest as though it might crack open from the weight of the poems inside. She had read them all again 3 times while waiting in the queue at the bus station, while on the ride, and again that morning before stepping into the small office above the print shop on Osu Road. The publisher's assistant, a young man with clear eyes and quick fingers, had smiled politely and told her, "Come back in 3 days." So she waited. 3 days later, she returned heart-pulsing. The publisher was seated behind a glass desk framed by tall wooden shelves. The books on display were glossy, modern, clean. Their titles spoke of heartbreak, politics, and redemption. She wondered if any of them had ever been written on the inside of a charcoal sack. He didn't look up immediately when she entered. Just flipped through a stack of papers, and then without raising his head, spoke. I read them. Her breath caught, and they're raw, he said, closing the folder. Rough, unedited. Abena nodded. Yes, she's young. She's never been trained. But if you look at the emotion, he held up a hand. They're not marketable. The word landed like ash in her mouth. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing lazily. Listen, we publish real stories here. Struggle, sure, but they have to sell. Who's going to buy a book full of poems written by a girl who lives in a shack with a dog and writes on garbage? Abena stood very still. She writes with a voice that makes the bones in your chest move, she said. Isn't that what literature is for? He sighed, tired. What you call literature, I call liability. You want honesty that sells 10 copies? You want something to last on a shelf? You need polish. Image. This is too bleak, too unfiltered. He handed her back the folder. There's no market for this. Abena took it. Her hands didn't tremble, but inside everything shook. She walked out of the office and down the narrow stairwell, the echo of his words clanging in her ears, too bleak, no market. As if truth had become toxic, as if sorrow had an expiration date. Back in the trotro, she sat by the window watching the buildings melt into fields, the horizon slipping into dust. The folder sat in her lap. For the first time, she wondered what she would tell Akosua. 2 days passed before she returned to the village. She told herself it was because the roads were bad, that she needed time to think. But really it was fear. She wasn't ready to see what disappointment would look like in Akosua's eyes. She stood outside the shack, its sunset folder clutched tight. Inside, Amma stirred the pot on the charcoal stove. The air smelled of beans and onion, faint but familiar. Akosua sat quietly tracing a charcoal nub across a torn piece of cardboard. She didn't look up when Abena entered. "I brought your poems back," Abena said. A pause. Did he like them? Abena opened her mouth, closed it. He said, "They were powerful." Akosua stopped writing. Her head turned slightly, but he said they weren't what he was looking for right now. Silence, the kind that squeezes between ribs and breaks the breath into sharp little pieces. "Oh." Abena stepped forward. "That doesn't mean—" Akosua stood abruptly. "It's okay." "It's not." "I said it's okay." Her voice cracked. She took the folder, opened it, pulled one poem out, then another. Too rough, right? Too dirty? Too sad? No, they don't want poems from girls who don't wear shoes. She turned and looked at Abena. Her eyes were dry but glowing like lit coals. They want clean suffering, neat, digestible. I'm not that. Akosua. But the girl had already turned. She snatched a few of the scraps, tore them down the middle. Again and again. Abena moved to stop her but froze. This wasn't her moment. Akosua dropped the torn pieces into the small cooking fire. They caught slowly, the ink curling into smoke. She didn't speak again that night. Didn't eat. Just sat in the dark with Obo curled on the mat, her head buried in the dog's fur. The next morning she was gone. Amma found her bed, empty, the wooden box untouched. The door swung open in the wind. Abena ran. She checked the charcoal yard, the cassava pit, the old schoolhouse. Nothing. Then a woman pointed toward the lake. She was walking toward the water, with the dog. The sky was heavy with cloud. The first drops had begun to fall soft and uneven. Abena ran harder, down the slope through the bramble past the old mango tree. The ground grew slick beneath her feet. She slipped once, caught herself on a rock. Her chest burned. Then she saw them. By the lake's edge, on a rock slick with rain, sat Akosua, her knees drawn up, Obo beside her. His golden fur was soaked, but he didn't move. Abena slowed. The girl didn't look back, just stared out across the water, gray endless. "Are you here to make me feel better?" Akosua said, voice barely above the wind. No, Abena answered. "Good." A pause. "I thought maybe the lake would know what to do with me," she said. "Maybe it would carry the words somewhere they belong." "I think it already has." Akosua shook her head. "They said my poems were too sad, too dark. They said they weren't ready. They'll never be ready." Obo nudged her hand. She let it fall to his head, fingers burying in his wet fur. "Do you want to stop writing?" Abena asked. "I don't know how to stop." "Then don't." The rain came harder. Thunder cracked across the lake. Abena took off her shawl and draped it over the girl's shoulders. "You were never writing for them," she said. "You were writing because something in you refuses to be silent." Akosua closed her eyes. Rain traced her cheeks like silent tears. "I feel like trash," she whispered. "You're not trash," Abena said. "You're fire that hasn't found its match." Akosua finally turned, and there it was, the break. Not a scream, not even a sob. Just a single tear that trembled before falling. She leaned against Abena's chest, small, shaking wet. Obo whined and pressed closer. They stayed like that as the rain swallowed the world. Minutes passed, then an hour. When the storm eased, they walked back slowly, hand in hand, the dog limping beside them. Amma was waiting on the steps. Her face was pale. But when she saw them, she opened her arms. Akosua ran into her, buried her face in her grandmother's chest. They didn't speak. They just held each other, soaked and silent as the night folded in. Inside, Abena sat alone, drying the poems that hadn't been burned. The fire hadn't taken all of them, and even if it had, the words lived elsewhere now. They were inside her, inside Akosua, and maybe, just maybe, waiting in the heart of someone else's storm. The mornings had grown quieter since the storm. The charcoal yard moved with its usual rhythm. Sacks loaded carts, creaked, dust settled. But something had shifted in Akosua. She no longer touched her scraps. The wooden box remained sealed beneath the bed, and the chalk stick worn to its final edge lay untouched on the sill. She still listened to the radio at night, still walked with Obo along the path to the lake. But the fire inside her had dimmed. Abena noticed, of course. She didn't push, didn't prod, but she stayed. Each afternoon she arrived with something small, a mango, a book of proverbs, an old song scribbled on paper. And once quietly, she slipped Akosua a new piece of white chalk. The girl took it without speaking. That weekend back in her guest quarters near the school, Abena sat late into the night, scrolling through her blog. A personal thing she'd started during university where she collected fragments of life from her travels. Photos, notes, stories. And now, for the first time, something else. She opened the folder of poems again. Her fingers hovered. Then she selected one. I built a room inside myself made of sackcloth and smoke. If you knock, I may not answer, but I'll leave the door open. She didn't post a name. Just the poem, the initials AK, and a single line of commentary. Found this written on the side of a charcoal sack in a place the world forgets. The girl who wrote it may never go to school, but her words carry more light than most of what we publish. She hit post and closed the laptop. The next morning, her phone rang before the sun had risen. Unknown number. Accra code. She answered. The voice on the other end was gravel and thunder. Old. Certain. Is this Abena Ankoma? Yes. You posted that poem last night. I did. Did you write it? No, she said, straightening. A student of mine did. I need to meet her. Abena blinked. Who are you? The voice chuckled, but there was no amusement. My name is Ibo Tago. I've published 73 books in my life. Poetry fiction essays. I stopped printing other people's words 10 years ago because none of them were worth the ink. That poem, he interrupted, was worth the ink. And if there's more, I want to see it. All of it. Immediately. Abena stood, heart racing. She's just a child. Even better, he said. Children don't lie when they bleed on the page. There was a pause. Then, bring her to Accra. Tomorrow. I'll cover transport. I'll be waiting. He hung up. The journey back to Accra was different this time. Akosua sat by the window, the folder in her lap, her eyes wide with a quiet anticipation she didn't dare name. Obo stayed behind with Amma, who had only said one thing when they left. If the world wants her words now, let it be, because it needs them, not because it wants to use them. When they arrived, the man waiting wasn't what Akosua expected. Ibo Tago looked like he had walked through too many storms and decided to stay wet. His beard was gray, untamed. His shirt had ink stains. His office smelled of paper dust and firewood. But his eyes, they were alive. He didn't greet them with pleasantries. Just gestured to the chair across from him. Red one, he said. Akosua hesitated. Out loud, her voice was soft at first. If I am made of ash, it is only because the world keeps setting fire to the things I love. Ibo didn't speak. She read another and another. With each line, her voice grew stronger, steadier. And something in the room changed. The air thickened. Even the old fan on the desk seemed to pause. When she finished, there was silence. Then Ibo leaned forward and said, Do not let anyone touch these. Akosua blinked. What? I will print them, as they are. No edits, no gloss. Abena stared. Truly, I've made my money, he said. Now I want to make something that matters. He pulled a sheet from his drawer and scrawled a title at the top, underlining it twice. Black Ash, White Soul. Akosua's breath caught. That was her title, Abena said quietly. She wrote it months ago. Ibo looked up. Then it stays. You don't change a name given by fire. The book took only weeks. Ibo worked like a man possessed. His assistant formatted the pages using photos of the original scraps. Some poems were left with spelling mistakes, some with smudges. They didn't care. It wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. When the first proof arrived, Abena handed it to Akosua on a bench outside the shack. Her fingers trembled as she touched the cover. There was no photo. Just a soft texture gray, like soot with the title embossed in white. Inside, every poem was there. Even the ones she thought weren't good enough. Especially those. She turned to the dedication page. It read, For every girl who thinks silence is the only place she belongs. Tears rolled down her cheeks, slow, warm, not from sadness, but from something deeper, recognition. The launch was held at the Provincial Library, small sunlit with worn wooden chairs and a broken microphone that squeaked when touched. There were no banners, no fanfare, Just folding chairs, open windows, and hearts wide enough to hold something real. The village came first. The school teachers, the charcoal vendors, the fishmongers. Then came the press. A few curious journalists, unsure what they were walking into. They left crying. Akosua stood in front of them, all holding the book with both hands. Her feet didn't reach the edge of the stage. Her voice was steady. I do not know if poems can build houses, but they built me a door. Silence, then applause, but not the loud kind. The kind that comes in waves, quiet, at first rising from the chest, because it's not for performance. It's for survival. Amma sat in the front row. She didn't clap. She wept. And when Akosua stepped off the stage, she walked straight into her grandmother's arms. You found your own voice, Amma whispered. And you let the world hear it. Akosua nodded against her shoulder. It was always yours too. Behind them, Abena stood, hands folded, eyes full. Ebo Tego approached her. She's not just a writer, he said. She's a mirror. The kind that shows people who they really are. Abena smiled. And what do you see? Ebo looked out at the crowd, men wiping eyes, women clutching books to their chests, teenagers too stunned to speak. I see a world that finally remembers what pain looks like, when it's honest, he said. The night ended with music, drums, laughter, light. Akosua sat outside on the library steps, the book beside her. She watched the people leave one by one, each with a piece of her in their hands. She didn't feel like a star. She felt like soil. And for the first time, that was enough. Inside her, the poems stirred again, not as screams, but as seeds, waiting, ready, alive. The sun that afternoon seemed more ceremonial than natural. Its golden rays cut through the tall windows of the provincial library, like stage lights illuminating the final hour of celebration. Copies of Black Ash, White Soul, were stacked in neat piles on a makeshift table by the exit, many already dog-eared by readers too eager to wait. Akosua had signed each one with a shy, crooked signature that looked more like a whispered apology than a name. But to those who received it, it was sacred ink. She stood quietly by the window, watching the way the dust danced in the sunlight. Obo pressed close against her leg. His coat was cleaner than usual, brushed carefully that morning, his red cloth collar tied with a proud knot by Abena herself. Amma sat on a bench nearby, her hands folded around a half-empty calabash of sobolo. Her eyes scanned the room, like a mother hen, always watching, never resting. And for once, there was a rare peace behind them, a kind of quiet satisfaction, like she'd finally handed something heavy to the sky and watched it float. Then the door creaked open, and everything froze. He was taller than anyone remembered, but not stronger. His shoulders slumped beneath a button-up shirt 2 sizes too large, and his shoes, though polished, scuffed at the toes. He carried a book under one arm. Akosua's breath hitched. She knew him, not from memory. Those were few and blurred by time, but from photos, from stories whispered and then denied. The man who left when she was 4. The one who chose the road over a child. Her father. He walked toward her, slowly, eyes trained on hers, like he wasn't sure she was real. Akosua, he said. Her name in his voice sounded like something borrowed. Amma stood at once. What are you doing here? He glanced at the older woman, but didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Akosua again, forcing a smile. You've grown. Akosua didn't move. Obo snarled low in his throat. I read your book, the man continued. I didn't even know you wrote. It's beautiful. Powerful. Amma stepped forward. She didn't write it for you. I know, but I'm here now. Too late, Amma snapped. The tension cracked through the air like lightning. He turned to her, raising his hands. Please, Mama Amma, just hear me out. You left. You left a 4-year-old child and a woman too sick to fetch water. And now you want a seat at the table. I was young. I made mistakes. You vanished. I was trying to find work. You found excuses. People had started to notice. A few turned their heads from conversations. The crowd thinned slightly near the door. The volume in the room lowered by instinct, as if the walls themselves leaned in. I'm not here to fight, he said, raising his voice just enough to carry. I just want to be part of this moment, of her success. You weren't part of the struggle, Amma said, eyes like steel. You don't get to share the victory. I'm her father. You were, once. Akosua stood still, trembling. The world blurred faces, books, hands. She could hear her heartbeat, could feel Obo pressed harder against her calf, protective and alert. The man turned back to her. "I want to make things right," how Amma demanded. By standing next to her for a photograph. By telling people you helped shape her when all you ever did was disappear. "I want to be here," he insisted. "I want her to know her father is proud." "Pride is cheap," Amma spat. "Where were you when she was eating one meal every 2 days, when her body burned with fever and I couldn't afford a doctor? When she wrote poems by candlelight because the radio was broken and the wind howled like it wanted to swallow her whole?" He said nothing because there was nothing to say. And then from that trembling silence, Akosua found her voice. It didn't rise in anger or accusation. It was soft, unmistakable. "If you ever loved me," she said, "you wouldn't need to wait for applause to come back." He blinked. "I used to think about you," she continued. "I used to imagine you coming through that door holding my name like a gift. But now I think you just remembered it when the world did." The room held its breath. He opened his mouth, closed it. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't reach for her. He nodded once, slow, almost grateful. Then he turned, walked to the door, and left. Obo barked once, sharp and final. The silence didn't break for several seconds. Then gently, Abena appeared at Akosua's side, placing a hand on her back. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She stood, a girl made of ash, refusing to be blown away. That night, the library lights stayed on long after the guests had left. Amma and Abena sat quietly on the steps, sharing roasted plantain. Inside, Akosua curled up with Obo beneath a donated quilt, a copy of her book clutched to her chest, not as proof, but as reminder. Not of who left, but of what remained. The letter came folded in thirds, wrapped in an ivory envelope, embossed with a crest she didn't recognize. It had been hand-delivered by a university courier who looked as surprised to be in a charcoal-scented village as the villagers were to see him. Akosua opened it, sitting under the old cassava tree with Obo resting beside her, one paw tucked beneath his chest like always. Her fingers trembled as she read the words. Not because they were long or complicated, they weren't, but because they carried the weight of something impossible. "Congratulations. You have been awarded the Kwame Idu Literary Fellowship full scholarship to the University of Ghana Department of Literature. Your voice is needed. Your journey begins here." She read it once, twice, then again, just to be sure the words didn't disappear like the ones she used to draw in the dust. Amma sat silently beside her, watching the way her granddaughter's lips moved without sound, as if she were reciting prayer. When Akosua looked up, she was crying, not loud, but real. Amma didn't ask what the letter said. She didn't have to. "I'm leaving," Akosua whispered. Amma only nodded. "It was never going to keep you here." That night, the house was silent in a way that was more sacred than sad. Abena had brought a small bag for Akosua, 2 new dresses, some pens, a notepad with a leather cover, and a thin second-hand copy of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. Amma had folded 3 sets of clothes herself and placed them at the bottom of the bundle with quiet hands. But it was Obo who noticed something was changing. He didn't move when she laid beside him. His breathing was shallow. The wheezing had worsened that week, slow and rattling, like something deep inside him was unraveling thread by thread. He no longer ran to the bay, then no longer barked at the goats, no longer followed her to the lake. He just lay there, still watching, but slower now, sleepier. Akosua curled up beside him on the mat. The oil lamp flickered above their heads. Outside, the wind pressed its fingers gently against the zinc walls. She ran her hand down his side, felt the rhythm of his chest. Not steady, but not gone. Then she reached for a piece of paper. It was old, soft at the edges, one of the few she'd saved from the earliest days. She took the pencil from the pocket of her dress and began to write. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately. Each word carved from the place behind her lungs, the place where Obo had lived since the beginning. Some dogs don't bark, they don't chase. They don't run in packs or guard fences. They just lie down beside sorrow and love it until it learns not to bite. She didn't cry while she wrote. She cried when she read it to him. Her voice was steady, but her chest shook. She leaned close, whispered the last line into his fur just above his ear. Some dogs don't need to be brave. They just stay. He opened his eyes once, licked her knuckles with a dry, gentle tongue, then laid his head down again. She stayed awake all night beside him, just breathing. The morning came quiet, too quiet. Akosua woke to find Obo still beside her. But something had shifted. His chest didn't rise. His nose was cold. His eyes were half open but unfocused. Still. Peaceful. Amma came in and stopped short. Abina arrived a few minutes later, breathless from the school path. No one spoke. Akosua stood. She wrapped him in a piece of her old dress, the green one with the frayed collar, and cradled him in her arms, like the first day she found him limping near the cassava pit. Then she walked, through the charcoal yard now empty, to the far edge, where the baiten met the start of the lake brush. There was a small patch of earth there, dry and cracked, but soft enough if you knew how to dig. She dug with her bare hands. No shovel, no tools. Just dirt under her fingernails and the weight of love in her arms. When the hole was deep enough, she lowered him in. Then she sat for a long time before placing the soil back. Abena brought a piece of broken wood from the edge of the school fence. Akosua took her pencil and etched into it, slowly, carefully. Here rests Obo. He never spoke, but he heard every silence. They placed it at the head of the grave, leaning slightly to one side. Akosua stood and dusted her hands. Then, for the first time since the letter arrived, she wept deep, guttural sobs, not held in, not poetic. Real. Raw. Like something had been torn from her chest and buried in the ground. Amma pulled her in. They stayed like that until the sun climbed past its second hour. That evening, the village gathered to say goodbye. They didn't have much to give, no banners, no feasts, but they came with songs, handshakes, folded paper blessings. One woman brought dried hibiscus. A young boy gave her a whistle carved from bamboo. A teacher from the nearby town offered a journal and said, "Don't stop. Not ever." When the trotro pulled up at dawn, Akosua was dressed in a plain blue dress, her new bag slung over one shoulder. Amma held her hand tightly. "I won't forget," Akosua said. Amma nodded, eyes glassy. "You can forget the dust, but don't forget what made you write in it." Abena hugged her last. "I'll visit," she promised. "You better," Akosua said, trying to smile. She climbed into the van. As it pulled away, she turned and looked back. Not at the people, not at the house, but at the edge of the charcoal yard, where a small wooden sign leaned in the wind, Obo's grave. Still, watching, waiting. Her heart beat once, then again. She turned forward and began. The city greeted her not with open arms, but with bright eyes and sharp teeth. Accra moved too fast, too loud. The buses barked instead of honked. The street vendors cried out with urgency, not melody. Even the rain fell harder, faster, as if time itself was in a rush to forget softness. Akosua arrived with a duffel bag, 3 notebooks, and a heart still mourning a dog buried under charcoal soil. The university campus was wide and green, dotted with sandstone buildings and students who wore headphones, like armor. Her room in the dormitory was small, neat, and sterile, painted in the kind of white that begged for color. She pinned Obo's red collar to the edge of her desk lamp and began to listen. The lectures were difficult at first, not because she didn't understand the words, but because they didn't ask her to feel. They wanted analysis, structure, form, dissect the sonnet, deconstruct the verse. What does this stanza mean? She wanted to ask, what does it survive? At night she wrote, in the quiet of her narrow bed beneath a thin sheet and a louder world, she began filling the pages again. Not with fire, but with dust. The kind that settled after grief. The kind you breathe in when trying to remember. She wrote of Amma's cough, of rain leaking through tin, of a dog who listened better than most humans, of a sack of coal with her name still hidden in the seams. But it was different now. The city demanded more. Not just pain. It wanted polish. Her classmates performed their poetry like monologues. Voices raised hands, waving metaphors, layered so thick they left no breath between lines. They applauded themselves. And then turned to her quiet, unsure what to do, with a girl who whispered instead of roared. She tried to adapt. Once, she read a new poem at an open mic. It began with rhythm. It ended with silence. The applause was polite, but not kind. That night she returned to her room and tore the poem in half. Not out of anger, out of honesty. It wasn't hers. She stared at Oboe's collar for a long time. Then slowly pulled out a blank page and wrote, "I once tried to sound like a city. But cities echo back the same names. I think I'm meant for quieter things like coal or graves or God." The days grew heavier, but so did her resolve. One morning she was called to the head of the literature department. She walked the halls, unsure whether she was in trouble. Instead, she was handed a letter, thick paper gold seal, a formal invitation. Ghana National Literary Forum, Emerging Voices Edition. You are selected as the youngest guest poet. Please prepare one piece for closing night. She read it twice, then looked up at the department head, who said simply, "Don't try to impress them. Just remember why you started." The forum was held in a colonial-era hall in the center of Accra. High ceilings, marble steps, the scent of old books and newer egos. She stood backstage, notebook in hand, surrounded by voices louder than her own. One young man adjusted his blazer and asked, "What's your theme?" She blinked. "Ash." He frowned, as in the thing left behind after everything else burns. He walked away. The host called her name, her full name. She stepped into the light, a girl in a plain dress, her braids pulled back, no makeup, no entourage, just memory and grief and breath. She approached the podium, flipped her notebook, looked up, then read. If the world began in ash, not Eden, not gold, but charcoal dust and smoke and bone, would anyone still write hymns? Would they praise the soot beneath the fingernails of the woman who raised them? Would they kiss the scar that heat left on the mouth of a child who dared to speak? If the world began in ash, would we still be ashamed of burning? Or would we name the coal after our mothers and say, "This is where light was born"? The silence afterward was full, not empty, full, a kind of reverence that doesn't clap. It breathes, it bows. Then someone in the back began to cry. Then another. She looked up once toward the exit and imagined Obo sitting by the door, quiet and proud. She smiled and closed her notebook. The wind in the village had changed. It no longer carried just the scent of coal and cassava, but something softer like pages being turned. Children ran through the narrow paths with books tucked under their arms. Their sandals kicked up ash and dust, but they didn't stop. They were chasing something more urgent than play. At the edge of the village, where the Baithen once stretched into silence, stood a new structure. It wasn't large, it wasn't painted, but it breathed. Wooden beams from torn-down shacks. A tin roof patched with tarp and care. Windows made from salvaged glass etched faintly with words that had once been whispered in the dark. At the center of the front wall, hung above the door, was a simple hand-carved sign, "Obo's House," where poems come to rest. Inside the shelves were uneven, but proud. Books stacked in rows and columns, old school books donated from Accra, journals bound with twine. But most of all, poems, written by children on anything they could find. Sacks, envelopes, sugar bags, clay tablets. Every piece hung on twine across the walls like a gallery of breath. At the far end of the room was a reading mat, a red scrap of fabric too large to be a towel, too worn to be a blanket. But the children sat on it like royalty. When they read, they sat tall. They didn't stutter. Akosua watched it all from the threshold. She had returned months ago quietly without fanfare. She didn't want ceremony. She wanted something slower, more deliberate. After the forum, after the scholarships and the interviews, the publishers and the panels, she packed a small bag and came home. The shack was gone. What remained was memory. And memory needed space to sit down. So she rebuilt it not alone, but with the help of the village. The woman who sold soap brought nails. The cassava vendor brought a table. The local carpenter gave his Sundays. Abena came with boxes of paper. Amma stood each morning by the fire, stirring porridge and reminding everyone that books meant nothing if they weren't fed. And when the first child stepped through the door and placed her poem on the wall, Akosua wept. Now she stood by the entrance arms, crossed a gentle breeze, tugging at the hem of her dress. A little girl approached, barefoot. Dust on her cheeks, hair tied with string. She was holding something. A coal sack, crinkled, half-burned at one corner. She walked past Akosua without a word and sat cross-legged on the mat. She opened the sack carefully, as if it might tear open into flame. There across the middle were white chalk words, crooked and misspelled. My name is small, but I think big thoughts. One day I'll write them down on something better than ash. The girl didn't notice she was being watched. She ran her fingers over the words once, then smiled. Not because she understood everything, but because she knew she would. Akosua stepped back from the doorway and looked out across the charcoal yard. It was quieter now. Fewer workers, less smoke. The world was changing, but ash still gathered in the corners, still waited, still whispered. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and in her voice, not the voice of a child, but the voice of a woman who had walked through fire and come out with a pen, she spoke. Ash is black, but if you listen long enough, you'll hear it speak light.